Hello, everyone. Dr. Yonit Arthur here. I'm an audiologist and strength coach. You are on the Steady Coach. And with this unedited video today, I'm going to be answering some of your questions about Meniere's disease. But first, I just want to warn you that because it's the summertime right now, you are probably going to hear some children screaming in the background. And I apologize in advance. This is the way my life works right now. So, Meniere's disease. The primary question that I get asked here on my channel is Meniere's disease neural circuit dizziness? And the answer to this is it's complicated. So buckle up. I'm going to tell you what I think you might want to know. So let me start off with the most controversial statement I'm going to make today, which is that many of you who have a Meniere's disease diagnosis do not actually have Meniere's disease. You have neural circuit dizziness. And I do differentiate between the two. Neural circuit dizziness is when you have dizziness that's being caused by a central nervous system prediction error. And of course, you can learn a lot more about this elsewhere on my channel if you're new here. But one of the criteria for neural circuit dizziness is you don't have a medical explanation or tissue damage that explains your symptoms. So many people with neural circuit dizziness have no signs of tissue damage at all, no signs of tissue dysfunction or damage. Some people do have signs of tissue damage or dysfunction, but they don't explain the symptoms. So this would be the case for people who have, for example, a unilateral weakness or hypofunction. In other words, one ear is weaker than the other. The brain normally compensates for that. And if it doesn't, we're dealing with neural circuit dizziness. Meniere's disease, on the other hand, true Meniere's disease means that there is some sign of actual physical damage to the inner ear structures. This damage is caused by swelling of the inner ear. We are not going to go into great depth about the pathophysiology of Meniere's disease today, but that swelling in the inner ear can cause both hearing and balance problems. And for most people with Meniere's, it actually causes both, but some people can have one or the other. So already you can see that we're dealing with two slightly different things. And I'm going to argue actually that they're very much connected. But some people, or I would say many people who were diagnosed with Meniere's disease, have absolutely no damage to their inner ear. They were just given the diagnosis because they have episodes of dizziness or vertigo that doctors can't otherwise explain. And I've joked, although this isn't really funny, that depending on who you see, which kind of doctor you see, you're going to get diagnosed with Meniere's disease or vestibular migraine if you have medically unexplained chronic dizziness. So ENTs, and I'm not calling out just ENTs here, there are many other types of doctors that are trained this same way, are taught that if you have episodes of unexplained dizziness symptoms, and if that person isn't constantly seeing vestibular stuff day in, day out, that person is going to smack a Meniere's label on you if you have those kinds of symptoms, even if there's no sign of ear damage whatsoever. And in those cases, again, that is just simply incorrect because the dizziness is not being caused by damage to the inner ear. It's medically unexplained. It's not caused by tissue damage. It's caused by a nervous system error. And in that case, everything on my channel applies to you. So if we think about what I have talked about, again, exhaustively elsewhere on my channel. So for those of you who are not new here, you've heard me say this a million times. All disease, all symptoms are biopsychosocial, meaning there's a biological component, a psychological component, and a social component. And that's actually kind of misleading to say all this because all three of those things are really one and the same. Our minds and bodies are connected to 100% of the time. So in other words, if we're socially isolated, that causes physical, biological, chemical changes in our bodies. If we're psychologically distressed, that causes a physical nervous system change. But neither here nor there, it's useful to kind of think about these three distinct components as being part of each disease, because in this case, when we are looking at Meniere's, we're looking at a complex biopsychosocial condition, as we are with neural circuit dizziness. The real question isn't, are they biopsychosocial? The question is, how much of them are psychosocial and how much of them are biological? So in the case of PPPD and MDDS, we are dealing with something way over on the end of psychosocial. In other words, the drivers of those conditions are primarily related to nervous system dysfunction. They're related to prediction errors. Again, many of the things I've talked about elsewhere on my channel, they're not really related to tissue damage or disease. Whereas something like a big brain tumor would be pretty biological. Like you can feel bad or be isolated or have lots of friends. Brain tumor doesn't care too much, right? It's gonna affect you. Meniere's is one of those things that's a little bit fuzzy and probably is a little bit different for everyone in terms of where it falls on the biopsychosocial spectrum. So, as I have already stated, and I cannot state this enough, many of you watching this video probably don't have Meniere's at all. So, if you were given the Meniere's diagnosis and you ask your doctor, why did I get this diagnosis? They're like, yeah, you have the symptoms that I've, noticed with it. And you say, okay, but is there any sign of ear damage? And they say no, then that's a good cause to question the diagnosis. But if you have Meniere's disease as a diagnosis and you were diagnosed by someone who's really familiar with vestibular disorders and has done comprehensive testing, and there is evidence of some kind of ear damage, then we're looking at a condition that has some components of neural circuit dizziness, but is also being driven by biological factors. Do not worry though. So the question often arises then, okay, does your stuff still apply to me? Should I bother to take the course? I know I have tissue damage. Get that question a lot. So let me just also clarify here as an aside. If you have tissue damage that's not from Meniere's disease, so say you have unilateral weakness, as we talked about before, or you had a concussion 5 years ago, that doesn't count as tissue damage. Your brain should have compensated by now. You should be fine, in which case the course totally applies to you. All the stuff I talk about on my channel applies to you. With Meniere's disease, those attacks in the inner ear are causing ongoing tissue damage that comes and goes and tends to get worse over time. So there is tissue damage that explains at least some of your symptoms. All right. But as I said, do not fear. There is a lot to take from my channel about Meniere's disease because there is actually quite a bit of evidence that Meniere's attacks are related to stress. And there's surprisingly little modern research on this. I'm actually really surprised when I look for it and I don't find a lot of it. A lot of it was in the early 2000s and late 90s. But there is evidence that stress and stress hormones show up in people with Meniere's disease. The link just isn't quite so clear. And you'll read some studies or some opinions from people who say, there seems to be some kind of link, but we're not really sure. It's not really clear. And then some other people might say it's very clear that stress is a factor, and some other people may deny stress as a factor at all. So here's where I come in with my opinion and say stress is absolutely a factor here. To deny that your psychosocial state is affecting your biology is a complete misunderstanding of how the human body works. We are complicated creatures. We are social creatures. Our emotional well-being and our mental states have a direct effect on our biology. So whether you have confirmed tissue damage, like the most obvious biological illness or not, your psychosocial state is always a factor. The question is simply how much. And my sense of this is just based on my experience. So again, this is my opinion, but based on exposure to many, 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 many people. Stress, I believe, is a huge factor in the onset of Meniere's disease and the frequency of attacks. And I've heard this both from people who have documented Meniere's disease and people who had just suspected Meniere's disease who ended up having neural circuit dizziness. The reason I think that it's so hard to establish this link in research is because we are not good at researching people's internal experiences of stress. So I'm going to give you an example. So let's just say we have two identical people, okay? And both of them have Meniere's disease, okay? Let's just say they both have documented Meniere's disease. And they go into one of these studies and the researchers are giving them one of these stress inventories and they're asking them about stress, okay? These stress inventories are typically looking at people's, first of all, the external experiences altogether, like have you been through this disaster? Have you been through that? Which tells us absolutely nothing about what's actually going on inside the person. or they're having the person rate his or her subjective experience of stress. Better, but still not that great. And here's why. Person A had a completely normal childhood, nothing to see here. Okay. Person B had a very stormy childhood. All right. Both of them in the last year before the study moved to a new house, which might not even show up on a stress inventory because it's not really something we think of as bad stress. So it's not might not even be something we ask about. Okay. First of all, that. But second of all, let's just say that person A, who had this incredibly normal childhood, went through the move and experienced kind of your normal average amount of stress from the stress of moving. Person B moved a lot around as a child. Let's say that person lost a parent to divorce and had to move at the time of the divorce and had to go through this process of adjusting to having separate homes with mom and dad. Let's just say that mom really suffered from mental health issues after the divorce and the child was kind of put into this position of being a caregiver. Okay. This isn't that far fetched. This isn't like, oh, this horrible traumatic experience. Let's just say that's what happened. Person B would take away from that experience to both be a world class repressor of feelings and go getter and possibly a compulsive caretaker. Now, obviously, again, this is just an example. So this may not apply to anyone who's gone through that experience, but you could see how that could happen, right? The child's learned, hey, I've got to be there for other people. Like my value is to care for other people. And also my feelings don't matter because I got to put my feelings aside because I got to take care of mom. Oh, and moving to new houses has these really negative associations for me. That might not show up in a questionnaire or in a session with a researcher. That person's internal stress load might be 3,000 times higher than the other person's, but that person may not subjectively rate his or her stress more highly because that person may have learned that his or her feelings don't matter and that that person's job is to just push through and just be there for everyone. In fact, some of the people I've met with childhoods like I described for person B happen to be some of the most capable, calmest people I've ever met. They're not super anxious people who aren't capable of things. They're like hyper responsible until they have a complete and utter meltdown with neural circuit dizziness or some other kind of medical or non-medical condition because their immune systems are just like, we're done. Okay. So my point here is that that kind of stress, internalized stress, and the other stress that we put on ourselves because of things that happened to us previously in our lives are not going to show up in some of these research studies. So my sense of this is that that kind of stress is what we really should be looking at when we're trying to decide if Meniere's has a very strong psychosocial component or not. And my expectation is that once we actually do this kind of research, we're going to see that, yes, there is a biological consequence of a Meniere's attack, but that it's being brought on by psychosocial factors. So if you are here and you have a Meniere's diagnosis, first of all, I want you to think critically about the diagnosis you got and determine if you actually have an appropriate diagnosis. Is there actually a sign that you have a disease process in your ear, or was it just symptom based? Because if it's the latter, then we really should be thinking about neural circuit dizziness. If you have signs of actual tissue damage, and it really seems like you have a progressive pattern of ear damage, which is what we would expect to see in Meniere's, you are not powerless here. It is not just a disease that requires you to like be nice and like have a stress-free lifestyle. You should be thinking more critically about this kind of internalized stress. And in that case, everything I talk about the course applies to you. Both your reactions to your symptoms can change and your reactions to all of the life stressors that you're inevitably going to go through and how much pressure you put on yourself. That is going to, in my opinion, likely reduce the frequency and intensity of attacks and make it far less likely that your brain's going to create symptoms between attacks. It's going to make it a lot easier for your brain to quickly adapt after an attack is over and get you back to your baseline. So I hope that this made some sense to you guys. Again, really complicated topic. And I know some of the comments are going to show up and say, I had this and this. Do I have Meniere's? I can't make that kind of assessment without actually examining you. You probably have a much better gut sense than you think you do. We humans have really good BS detectors. See if you can make a call on this on your own. Did your doctor confidently make this diagnosis based on evidence, or was this based on lack of evidence? All right. So, of course, please feel free to drop questions or comments below. And if you enjoyed the video, please like, share, and subscribe. I will talk to you guys soon. Thanks for tuning in.